So for glycolysis, and here we are talking about a eukaryotic cell. So where does glycolysis take place in a eukaryotic cell?
It's a great
In the cytoplasm.
Yep. What about the intermediate step?
No homework.
The mitochondrial
No homework for this
matrix.
class. You do not have to
What about the Krebs cycle?
Also in the matrix.
Yep. The electron transport chain?
The inner mitochondrial membrane.
Yep. Again, we are talking about a eukaryotic cell here, right? If we were talking about a prokaryotic cell, then glycolysis, the intermediate step, and Krebs cycle all take place in the cytoplasm of a prokaryote. And the electron transport chain is in the plasma membrane of a prokaryote, right? So there are some differences. So when it comes to the total amounts, we are talking about the maximum theoretical yields, right? So how many ATPs in glycolysis? Remember, you guys have to talk to me. I can't see chats.
Two.
Two. How many NADHs?
Two.
Any FADH2?
No.
Nope. The intermediate step, is any ATP made in the intermediate step?
One.
Hmm?
Is it one?
No ATP in the intermediate step. What about NADH?
Two.
Any FADH2?
No.
For the Krebs cycle, I think somebody needs to turn their microphone off. For the Krebs cycle, how many ATPs?
Two.
NADH?
Is it six?
Yep. FADH2?
Two.
Two, right? And so we can all add these. So when it comes to the numbers of ATPs produced by all of these, you know, we did have that table before, right? In glycolysis, the two ATPs are by substrate level phosphorylation, none in the intermediate step, and two in Krebs for a total of four. Now for the number of ATPs produced by the NADH, since we know there are two NADHs produced in glycolysis, remember they yield how many ATPs?
Each yields three.
Three each.
Right, so since there's two ATPs, or two NADHs, there would be six, right? ATPs. In the intermediate step, we know that two NADHs are produced, which means six ATPs from those two NADHs, and the Krebs cycle We know there were 6 NADHs, and they make 18 for a total of, right, 30. In the FADH2, we only had 2 of those produced in the Krebs cycle, and we said that they yield 4 ATPs. So why is it, again, that you get more ATP from the electrons in NADH than you do from the electrons in FADH2?
Because NADH is earlier on the electron transport chain, so there's more hydrogen.
Right, so remember, as the electrons are, donated and transferred from complex to complex in the membrane, hydrogens get pumped across the membrane against their concentration gradient, where they accumulate in a high concentration. And so the electrons are the source of energy to pump those hydrogens against their concentration gradient. And so NADH, it donates its electrons to the first complex in the chain, which means the maximum number of hydrogens gets pumped, which will yield the maximum number of ATPs. FADH2 donates its electrons later in the transport chain, so the electrons are not able to pump as many hydrogens as the NADH electrons do. So fewer hydrogens means less ATP. And remember, the hydrogen ion gradient is an alternate form of energy that ATP synthase uses to make ATP. As those hydrogens flow through the ATP synthase, following their concentration gradient from high to low, that movement of hydrogens is a form of energy, and that allows ATP synthase to make ATP. So aerobic cell respiration yields a maximum theoretical number of ATPs, 36 to 38. But that would be if everything was perfect, there's no waste, no energy loss, and we know no perfect system exists. So in reality, the numbers of ATP are lower, like 29 to 30 maximum, but it's easier to talk about the maximum theoretical yield because those are nice whole numbers. And that's what you'll be responsible for, is the maximum theoretical yields. So any questions on this handout? All right, so now we've summarized aerobic cell respiration. Now we can start talking about photosynthesis. So something that is just as complicated as cell respiration is. But as we're going to see, they are related to each other. So I'm sure you're, familiar with the concept of photosynthesis in general, using light energy to make food and oxygen. But now you're going to find out some of the details of how that happens. So photosynthesis is the process that converts solar energy into chemical energy. So the light that comes from the sun is going to be used in photosynthetic organisms, not just plants, but photosynthetic organisms, to convert that solar energy into chemical energy. So both ATP and ultimately glucose or some form of carbohydrate. Glucose, fructose, sucrose, starch, something like that. Directly or indirectly, photosynthesis nourishes almost the entire living world. Why did I highlight almost?
Because, like, really deep down in the ocean, there's no sunlight, but there's still.
Right. So right? The deep sea thermal vents, those incredible organisms that live down there where absolutely no light reaches. It's pitch black, it's completely dark. In that case, photosynthesis is not the process used to make chemical energy. It's chemosynthesis, using inorganic chemicals like sulfur in the form of toxic sulfides. And that serves as the source to make a chemical energy. So incredible ecosystems deep beneath the ocean. So autotroph is a word that refers to organisms that don't eat anything derived from other organisms. So when you see the word auto, you can either think of self, right, because they don't need any other organisms, or you can think of automobile and what comes out of it, which is carbon dioxide. And that's what autotrophs use. They use carbon dioxide and other inorganic compounds for both energy or, for energy. So autotrophs are considered producers, sometimes called primary producers in the biosphere. So they don't need any other organisms. They just need light and carbon dioxide. And those are photoautotrophs, what we're mostly focused on. There are chemoautotrophs, which don't use light. They use inorganic, compounds along with CO2. But those are certain microorganisms, often referred to as, rock-eating microorganisms because they digest minerals in rock because they're using inorganic compounds. But photoautotrophs are the primary producers for most of the biosphere, for most of the Earth. And they make organic compounds like sugar from water and carbon dioxide. So photosynthesis occurs in plants, algae, some protists like Euglena, certain paramecia, and some prokaryotes. So there are some photosynthetic bacteria. These organisms feed not only themselves, but almost all of the living world, right? Because they produce carbohydrates, they produce oxygen. And so most of the living world is dependent on the primary producers. So here we see examples, and you're all familiar with plants. You've seen, trees, shrubs, flowers, grass, all that good stuff. And they're using solar energy, and they're making oxygen, and they're storing chemical energy for themselves. Certain plants, humans like to eat, for food, but many other insects and animals, eat leaves and stems, and that's how they get their energy. We have algae, and this is large algae like kelp. Some small protists, and this is Euglena, which are green, right? So they can photosynthesize, but they also engulf food and they swim around, right? Because they have a flagellum that you can see. And so Euglena are examples of some organisms which have characteristics of more than one kingdom. So again, it's green, it photosynthesizes like a plant, but it's not in the plant kingdom. It swims around and it engulfs food like an animal, but it's not in the animal kingdom. So whenever you have organisms that don't fit neatly into the other kingdoms, and they often have characteristics of more than one kingdom, you stick it into Protista. That's why these things are called protists, right? Because they're in the kingdom Protista. Cyanobacteria is a fancy word for blue-green algae. So cyanobacteria are prokaryotes, but they also are a type of algae, and they're big. I mean, these form long, threads of green algae, and they can form thick mats on bodies of water like ponds and lakes. And so they're big, easy to see. They're photosynthetic. They do produce oxygen. And even though they're a type of algae, they have to be prokaryotes. And the reason why is that they do not have a nucleus. So even though they're big and they're like algae, they have no nucleus. So by definition, they're prokaryotes. But they do produce oxygen. Now there are some bacteria, like the purple sulfur bacteria, that are photosynthetic, but they do not produce any oxygen. So not all photosynthesis produces oxygen. Most photosynthesis does, and we call that oxygenic photosynthesis because it makes oxygen. But there are certain microorganisms that photosynthesize but do not make any oxygen, and we call that anoxygenic photosynthesis. So no oxygen is produced. They believe that anoxygenic photosynthesis evolved first, and then later the ability to produce oxygen with photosynthesis evolved later. So not all photosynthesis produces oxygen. In some cases, all it does is make ATP for those microorganisms, but no oxygen. A heterotroph is an organism that uses organic compounds for both energy and carbon, so they typically have to eat something else. So a heterotroph eats something else. Heterotrophs are consumers in the biosphere, so they consume other organisms. Almost all heterotrophs, including humans, depend on photoautotrophs for food and oxygen. And so it's the photoautotrophs, it's the plants, algae, and other photosynthetic organisms that make oxygen. We are dependent on them. So a few words about consumers and producers and food chains. So we call the different groups of trophic levels. And so, for example, the base of food chains is composed of primary producers, those photosynthetic organisms. Primary consumers are the animals that eat the primary producers. So these are herbivores that eat the plants. A secondary consumer is an animal that eats the herbivores. A tertiary consumer and above are animals that eat other consumers. And so what's important about this pyramid is that if you look here on the right side, what that's showing you is the percent of energy that came from the sun. So obviously the primary producers, since they're photosynthetic organisms, they derive 100% of their energy from the sun. The herbivore, the primary consumer that eats the producers, they get about 10% of their energy that ultimately came from the sun. So the original solar energy used by the primary producers, by those plants, only about 10% of that energy is assimilated by an herbivore, right, by the primary consumer. A secondary consumer, right, the animal that eats the herbivores, they get only about 1% of the original solar energy. And then as you move up the food chain, it's less and less. So a tertiary consumer gets about 0.1% of the original energy that came from the sun. And here are some examples of the different trophic levels. Producers, all green plants and most photosynthetic organisms. Herbivores, they eat the producers, insects and certain other animals, like cattle, horses, those kinds of things. A primary carnivore is one of our secondary consumers, and they eat the herbivores. A secondary carnivore is a tertiary consumer, and it eats the primary carnivores. Omnivores eat at different levels, right? And an omnivore can eat plants or animals, so they eat at all different levels. And then detritivores and decomposers are those organisms like fungi and bacteria, earthworms, even vultures, because they eat dead animals, right? So they eat dead things. And so they help to keep the environment sort of clean because they eat all those dead things. But when it comes to the energy usage, here's another pyramid, which shows the primary producers, primary consumers, the herbivores, secondary consumers, the primary carnivores, and so on. What you notice is that the original energy, which came from the sun, right, 100% by the primary producers, but with each different trophic level, less and less of the original solar energy is assimilated by these animals. And so when it comes to growing food, so let's say you are a farmer and you have a certain piece of land, right, whether it's an acre, 100 acres, whatever you have. And so you have a choice. You can use that land to grow fruits and vegetables, or you can use that land to, raise cattle or sheep or pigs, whatever animal you like to eat. So what's more efficient in terms of energy use? Raising or growing the fruits and vegetables, or raising the animals for food?
Fruits and vegetables.
Right, the vegetables, right? Because they just get their energy from the sun. You just have to put them in the ground, water them, maybe fertilize them. It depends on where you are, and that's it. But if you're raising animals, the animal has to eat something else. It's got to eat plants, right? Or you have to provide it with animal feed. So when you look at the resources needed to raise food, again, it's more efficient to raise fruits and vegetables than it is to raise animals. And the reason why I bring this up is because there are certain places, like in Brazil with the rainforests, and they are destroying rainforests to raise cattle. And that's bad for everyone when they do things like that. Destroying the biodiversity down there, destroying all the oxygen production down there, destroying the ability to absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in order to raise cattle. I mean, that's a bad idea. It's not efficient. It's not an efficient use of energy or resources to do something like that. If you have nice, large, open plains, grassy plains like we have here in the US, well, it's not, quite as strong an argument against that, but still, it's not the most efficient way to raise food. And we actually get very little energy from meat. The amount of energy that it takes to produce that animal, and then what you end up getting is just a fraction of all the energy put into, growing that animal. Whereas, fruits and vegetables, we get a lot more out of that. So when it comes to efficiency of energy and resources, it is more efficient to grow fruits and vegetables than it is to grow animals. So when it comes to the organelles where photosynthesis occurs, we know those organelles are chloroplasts. And they are very structurally similar to certain photosynthetic bacteria. Remember last time we talked about the endosymbiotic theory, where one prokaryote was engulfed by another one, but the engulfed cell survived. It wasn't eaten. Over many, many eons of time, the symbionts specialized for energy production, forming either a mitochondrion or a chloroplast. And the structural organization of cells allows for the chemical reactions of photosynthesis to occur. And so the structure of a chloroplast, which we'll see shortly, enables photosynthesis to occur very efficiently. So in plants, leaves are the major locations of photosynthesis. It can also occur in stems. A green stem also has chloroplasts, so photosynthesis can occur in plants that have green stems. Some plants have stems that you don't think are stems. So for example, a potato. A potato is actually a modified stem. It is a stem, it's not a root. It's a stem. Roots grow out of the stem, and it's a stem specialized for storing starch, but it is a stem. And if you leave a potato exposed to sunlight, the skin starts turning green because it is a stem and photosynthesis is starting to occur. It also produces toxins, so you should not eat potatoes that are green. It can make you very sick. So green is caused by the pigment chlorophyll. And chlorophyll is the light absorbing pigment, not the only one, but it's the primary pigment in leaves responsible for absorbing light energy for photosynthesis. Carbon dioxide is going to enter the plant, and oxygen is going to leave the plant, because remember, oxygen will be produced. It has to be released by the plants. And the plants need carbon dioxide to make sugars. And so there are openings in the leaves called stomates. You know, technically, if you want to get fancy, it's stomata and stoma, you know, for singular and plural. But stomate and stomates is a lot easier, especially when we start talking about the inside of a chloroplast, because the chloroplast has, you know, a liquid center analogous to the mitochondrial matrix, except it's called the stroma. So stroma and stoma are too close together. So let's just use the word stomate and stomates, you know, for the openings on the leaves. Most of the stomates are on the bottom of the leaf, but there are also some on top. But stomates are pores that open and close to allow oxygen out and carbon dioxide in. Water also evaporates through the stomates. In that way, water continually moves through the roots, up the stem, and out the leaves. So water can continuously move through that plant. Chloroplasts are found mainly in the cells of the mesophyll, so the interior tissue of a leaf. Remember, we talked about how the leaf structure related to its function, because leaves were thin, but they were wide, so they could capture a lot of that solar energy, right? A fat, round leaf is not as efficient, you know, for photosynthesis, unless the plant is trying to store water in its tissue. So there are some kind of very plump, you know, succulent leaves, but that's for storing water, because those plants typically grow in dry environments. But most leaves are typically flat and they're wide to allow for efficient, you know, gathering of solar energy. A typical mesophyll cell has about 30 to 40 chloroplasts. That's a lot of chloroplasts, you know, per cell. And the chlorophyll is in membranes of the thylakoids. So we have membranes inside the chloroplast, which are analogous to the inner mitochondrial membrane. Although in this case, the membrane is not folded, it's organized into sacs, into like little bags, and they're called the thylakoids. And when you have a bunch of these thylakoid sacs all stacked together, they refer to those as grana. Inside the chloroplast is that liquidy center called the stroma, which, as I said, is analogous to the mitochondrial matrix, but that's why I don't want to use the word stomata or stoma for stomates, because stoma and stroma sound the same. So let's just use stomate, for the openings in the leaves. So here we see our leaves, and the mesophyll layer is the one where you find all the chloroplasts. We have our stomates on the bottom of the leaves mostly, but they also occur on the top side as well, but they're mostly on the bottom. And so oxygen can leave the plant and CO2 can enter. Also, water evaporates through the stomates. So here we have a chloroplast. It does have two membranes, but then it has a third membrane, which is all the thylakoids. And so the thylakoid membrane is analogous to the inner mitochondrial membrane. And this is where we are going to find our chlorophyll and our electron transport chains and our ATP synthase. So the thylakoids are analogous to the inner mitochondrial membrane in many ways, but there are two membranes surrounding the chloroplast. Here we have an electron micrograph, a transmission electron micrograph, so we're looking at a cross-section inside of a chloroplast. And you notice there are some similarities to a mitochondrion, right? It's a membrane-bound organelle. It is another powerhouse for the cell. ATP gets made here. It's just light energy is going to be used instead of glucose, right? So glucose is the source of potential chemical energy for aerobic cell respiration. Here, it's a light energy. But there are some other similarities in the process, as we'll learn most likely tomorrow. So the equation for photosynthesis, carbon dioxide plus water and light energy makes sugar, oxygen, and water. So we can simplify this and get rid of the excess water molecules. And here's our simplified equation. 6CO2 plus 6H2O plus light energy gives us C6H12O6 plus 6O2. Does this look familiar to you? Is this equation familiar? I should hear a lot of resounding yeses coming from you guys.
Yes, it's the opposite of cellular respiration.
Right, it's the opposite equation. In cell respiration, you go from right to left, right? Our glucose plus oxygen yields carbon dioxide, water, and energy, ATP and heat. Here, it's the opposite. CO2 and water plus light energy is used to make sugar and oxygen. So photosynthesis and cell respiration are basically the opposite equations of each other. So this is another equation that you must memorize. So you must know the simplified equation for cell respiration and the simplified equation for photosynthesis. So you must know those. So we talked about glucose supplying the electrons for the electron transport chain in cell respiration. In photosynthesis, we also need electrons, but those electrons are going to come from water. So water is actually going to be split. And when it's split, oxygen will be released. So the oxygen that is produced by photosynthesis occurs at the very beginning of the process because water serves as the source of electrons. And the light energy helps to split the water molecule. And so we call that photolysis or photolysis. And we'll see that term later. But at the very beginning of the process, light energy is used to split water so that electrons can be captured. And those electrons will be used in an electron transport chain in order to pump hydrogens and make ATP. So again, the difference here between photosynthesis and cell respiration is that in cell respiration, glucose provides the electrons. Here in photosynthesis, water provides the electrons. So this is just illustrating the idea that the CO2, the carbon and carbon dioxide will be used in the sugar, and the oxygen will be used in making the sugar as well as producing some water. And the water that is used to split, to release those electrons, the hydrogens and oxygen, or the hydrogens can get incorporated into the sugar. Some of the other hydrogens are used to make some water, and then the oxygen is released. So if we were looking at the simplified equation, these waters disappear down here, and we just have 6 waters here. So you don't have to memorize this. It's just showing you that the different atoms of the reactants are used to make the products. So you can find those reactant atoms in the products. So photosynthesis is a redox process in which water is oxidized and carbon dioxide is reduced. So remember that in aerobic cell respiration, which is also a redox process, glucose is oxidized into carbon dioxide, and oxygen is reduced to make water. So in photosynthesis, CO2 is going to be reduced to make sugar, and the water is going to be oxidized to produce oxygen. So again, it's basically sort of the opposite process, right? The opposite things are happening. So just to refresh you guys about cell respiration, is that a catabolic or an anabolic process? Aerobic cell respiration, is it catabolic or anabolic? It's catabolic, right? A food molecule is going to be broken down to produce energy, right? So that's catabolism. The overall delta G for cell respiration, is it positive or negative? It's negative, right? It's a spontaneous exergonic process because of the hydrolysis of ATP. So photosynthesis does consist of 2 parts, the light reactions, or the photo part, and the Calvin cycle, which is the synthesis part. A long time ago, they referred to both the light reactions and the dark reactions, although the Calvin cycle doesn't happen just in the dark. But they used to refer to them as the light reactions and dark reactions. So if you see dark reactions somewhere, what they mean is the Calvin cycle, which is where the glucose or the carbohydrate gets made. So in the thylakoids, we have the light reactions. Water is split, oxygen gets released right away. NADP plus, so in cell respiration, we had NAD, which was reduced to NADH. Here it's NADP, which is reduced to NADPH, but it's doing the exact same thing, except that we have a phosphorylated version of NAD, which is used in photosynthesis, but otherwise it's the exact same thing. It is an electron carrier, but in this case, the NADPH is not going to carry electrons to the electron transport chain, So there is a difference here. So electrons ultimately will be used to reduce the NADP plus to make the NADPH. But the NADPH is going to be used in the Calvin cycle to reduce that carbon dioxide to make sugar. So a slight difference that we'll see later on. And again, the ATP is going to be produced from ADP using the same enzyme, ATP synthase, but instead of oxidative phosphorylation, here it's called photophosphorylation because the light energy is being used to make ATP. So in cell respiration, we know that a little bit of ATP is made by substrate level phosphorylation, where a phosphorylated organic compound will donate its phosphate to ADP to make ATP. And then most of the ATP was made through oxidative phosphorylation, with the electron transport chain and chemiosmosis. Here, though, it's not oxidative phosphorylation, it's called photophosphorylation. So the Calvin cycle occurs in the stroma of the chloroplast. It forms sugar from carbon dioxide using ATP and NADPH. And so we call this process of incorporating carbon dioxide into an organic compound carbon fixation. So they use the word fixation for different processes. It just means to incorporate. So we're inside a chloroplast. You notice that we have our thylakoid sacs here, which are green because that's where the chlorophyll is. Light energy is going to excite chlorophyll molecules and help to split the water to produce oxygen and a source of electrons. As we're going to learn in much detail later, ATP will be produced along with the NADPH. So we've got energy and stored electrons. But here the stored electrons are going to be used to reduce carbon dioxide to make sugar. So the ATP and NADPH are used in the Calvin cycle in order to make sugar. And this is a CH2O is just a generic way to represent sugar because it's not necessarily glucose. It could be sucrose, which is made of glucose and fructose. It could be starch. It could be cellulose, right? So they're all carbohydrates made by plants. So if only this was all you needed to know, right? Unfortunately, you need to know a lot more details about what happens inside the chloroplast. So is photosynthesis catabolic or anabolic?
Anabolic.
It's anabolic because the result is biosynthesis, right? To make the carbohydrates, the overall process. So is the delta G positive or negative?
Positive.
It's positive, which is why we need the input of solar radiation, right? Of light energy in order to make this process happen. And so chloroplasts are solar-powered chemical factories. And their thylakoids transform light energy into the chemical energy of ATP and NADPH. So let's talk about light, first, because light energy is being used, so you need to understand something about light. So light is a form of electromagnetic energy, a form of electromagnetic radiation. Like all other forms of electromagnetic energy, light travels in rhythmic waves. So it travels in waves. The wavelength is the distance between the crests of the waves, so from peak to peak. And the wavelength determines the type of energy. So here we see our EM radiation which travels in waves, and the wavelength is the distance from peak to peak, or crest to crest, and that determines how powerful the energy is. If the wavelengths are big, if they're large, then that's lower energy. So the higher the wavelength number, the lower the energy, right, that radiation has. But the shorter the wavelength, right, the smaller the wavelength number, the higher the energy has. So if we look at the EM spectrum here, if we start with radio waves, are very long waves, right? A distance between the crest to crest is measured in meters, many, many meters. So these are long waves. Radio waves get shorter, radar TV, between a centimeter and a meter long wave, so long waves. If we move into the infrared, we're getting into the nanometer range, so much smaller, more intense forms of EM radiation. And then we have a very narrow band here, which is visible light in different colors, ranging from about 400 nanometers up to 700 nanometers. And so one of the ways that you may have learned to remember the colors, anybody learn an acronym to remember the colors?
Roy G. Biv.
Yeah, Roy G. Biv, right? Which stands for red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. But that was actually backwards. It's actually Vib Gior, right? So Vib Gior, which doesn't sound as much like a name as Roy G. Biv does, but the colors actually go violet, indigo, blue, green, yellow, orange, red. So technically it's Vib Gior is how you read the colors from left to right, not Roy G. Biv. So below the violet, we get into ultraviolet, UV. And once we start getting into UV, we start getting into very damaging forms of radiation because UV causes damage to cells, right? If you're exposed to too much UV, you get sunburned. You might destroy your epithelial cells completely and you get blisters. Repeated exposure over many years can cause skin cancer. UV radiation can be used to sterilize surfaces. So UV lights are often used to sterilize surfaces. You can use UV to sterilize thin liquids. And I say thin because UV is not penetrating. It doesn't penetrate deeply into your tissues, just into the skin. It doesn't penetrate through solid objects. It just can sterilize the surface. But it can kill microorganisms. It can kill your cells. So UV also does damage to your eyes, leading to cataracts, which is why ideally whenever you're outdoors, you should wear sunglasses that block UV. If you wear, glasses all the time, most people get the polycarbonate plastic lenses, and polycarbonate blocks UV. So polycarbonate is a cheap plastic. All sunglasses that are plastic are made of polycarbonate. It's cheap. All sunglasses by law must meet the exact same standard and block at least 99% of UV rays. So a $10 pair from Walmart is just as good as a $100 pair from Neiman Marcus. So don't waste your money. It's the law. All sunglasses must block the same amount of UV, which is at least 99%. And so it's all accomplished with cheap polycarbonate plastic. So don't waste your money on expensive sunglasses that look cool, right? Because you're just wasting your money. Beyond the UV, we get to X-rays. X-rays, as you know, are very penetrating, right? They go through your body. Right? That's how we get pictures of bones and things inside your body. And then gamma rays are the highest form, the most intense form, the shortest wavelengths. So very, very small wavelengths. But that's bad because gamma rays basically penetrate almost everything. So nuclear explosions, atomic bombs release gamma rays. And so that radiation will kill you. But they all travel as waves. But for photosynthesis, we're concerned with the visible light spectrum. And not all colors of visible light are used by plants, only certain colors. And remember, white light is composed of all the different wavelengths of light. So all the different colors make up white light. If you've ever seen a prism, you've seen a prism, a crystal that will split light into different wavelengths, right? Have you all seen things like that before? So white light is composed of all the colors of the visible spectrum. We interpret that as white. So light also behaves as though it consists of discrete particles called photons. And so photons are massless particles, so they have no mass. And by definition, they cannot have mass because they travel at the speed of light. And so if anything has mass, it can't reach the speed of light. And you can ask a physicist why, but it has to do with Einstein's famous equation. So a photon is a massless particle, which is why it can travel at the speed of light, but nothing else can. So another image, showing you the colors and the energy levels. So again, very, very short wavelengths, very high in energy. Very long wavelengths, very low in energy. But they all do pass through us. Radio waves are passing through you as I speak, right? They pass through, ordinary buildings and things like that, and they pass through us. Microwaves are good for food, right? Microwave radiation is what's used to heat up your food. Anybody know how microwaves work? How do they heat up your food? You all use microwaves, but you don't know how it works? Is it magic? Push a button, a light comes on, and your food gets hot? It's witchcraft. How do microwaves work? I know while I'm waiting for an answer, some of you are Googling it. But microwaves stimulate water molecules, especially water molecules. But they get excited, they stimulate, they vibrate, they move more. And so when they have more kinetic energy, they produce heat. And that's what cooks your food, is the amount of water that's in it. So the water molecules get excited, they vibrate, they make heat, and that's how your food cooks. So when it comes to pigments, these are substances that absorb visible light. And different pigments absorb different wavelengths of light. That's why we see different colors. Wavelengths that are not absorbed are reflected or transmitted back. So the wavelengths of light that bounce back to us, those are the colors that we see. All the other colors get absorbed except the ones that bounce back. So when you look at a green plant, it's green because those wavelengths of light that are green are what are bouncing back to our eyes. and that's what we see. So all the colors that you see are the ones that are not being absorbed by something. They're the ones that are being reflected back to you. So if you see white, all the colors are being reflected back to you. If you see black, none of the colors are being reflected back to you. But since leaves are green and chlorophyll is green, would using green light be effective for photosynthesis?
No.
No, because that's the wavelength of light that's being reflected back. It's not being absorbed. So if you use green light to try and grow plants, they're all going to die, right? Because they're not able to absorb that wavelength of light that's green. It's being reflected back to us. So not all the colors are necessarily used for photosynthesis. In particular, two colors are. So again, just trying to show you the light that goes through. Certain wavelengths will be absorbed. The wavelength that is not absorbed is the one that we see, which is green, right? Because it's not being absorbed by the plant. Now, leaves, even though they look green, they have different colored pigments in them. You can see these pigments in the fall, because in the fall, as trees and other plants with leaves are going dormant, they stop producing chlorophyll, and the chlorophyll gets degraded, and what's left behind are the accessory pigments. And that's why the leaves are very pretty colors of reds and oranges and yellows, because those are the other pigments that are present. You just can't see them because there's so much chlorophyll. It all just looks green. But these are accessory pigments that actually help with photosynthesis. And so there are different kinds of pigments. We see carotenes or carotenoids, which are typically yellows and oranges, along with the xanthophylls. Certain plants make anthocyanins, which are red, right? So not all leaves have any red in them. It just depends on what accessory pigments they have. Mostly we focus on the two types of chlorophyll, and there are two types, A and B. And then one group of accessory pigments are the xanthophylls, and the other group are the carotenes, also known as carotenoids. And one of the labs that we'll talk about tomorrow involves separating these pigments. And so if you take a bunch of green leaves and you grind them up and you extract the pigments, you can separate them using paper chromatography. And we'll go over this in more details, but it separates out those four main groups of pigments: chlorophyll B, A, xanthophylls, and the carotenes. And so we'll see more about this tomorrow in the lab that we do, but it's something you would have done in a class face-to-face to see that there are different pigments inside of a green leaf. So we're going to stop here for today. We'll talk about a spectrophotometer tomorrow and continue on with our lecture on photosynthesis. And then the lab we're doing is, I believe it's photosynthesis, isn't it? Or it's crickets, maybe the cricket lab for cell respiration. And then next Tuesday, we'll do the photosynthesis lab. So anyway, so any questions so far about photosynthesis? And this is all the easy stuff so far.